Hey everyone, welcome to Almost 2022. This is my conversation with the expert nudger, if you will, the healthcare nudger extraordinaire. We're going to have a conversation about habits, we're going to have a conversation about identity, and we're going to tie it into what's going on as we speak. If you are in medical affairs, if you are a medical science liaison, you are talking to people and going, I want to be a better version of myself. This is probably the right conversation for you. We've had a conversation very recently about leadership, and we're going to talk about tips, tricks, and ways to become a better you, and accepting who you are, just making a better version of that. So our guest today is, and I want to do this all right because there's so much to talk about with her, but she co-leads the healthcare division globally at behavioral science consultancy at BVA Nudge Unit. Previously, she co-founded an industry-leading social science group at a global marketing network, McCann Health. She's a graduate of Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health Master's Program, where she now returns to deliver guest lectures on behavioral economics and choice architecture. All of that sounds super, super interesting and super, super impressive. But what makes it even more interesting is she can connect it all to healthcare, and that's the conversation I want to have today. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest for today is Suzanne Kirkendall, MPH. And this is the Darshan Talks live stream, and I am your host, Darshan Kulkarni. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. I do have to emphasize, I'm an attorney, I'm not your attorney. I'm a pharmacist, I'm not your pharmacist. My guest is a nudging expert. She's not your nudging expert. So this is neither legal advice, nor clinical advice, nor nudging advice. These are considerations, and they don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the guest, the host, our employers, our clients, or our, anything else I've left out. These are just educational discussions. If you like what you hear, please like, leave a comment, please subscribe, please share. Please feel free to ask our guests questions. We already know that people are interested in jumping in. You can always find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. And having said all of that, our guest for today is Suzanne. So Suzanne, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. I'm very excited to be back. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I am excited because it's almost 2022 and I'm ready for 2021 to be over. I'm a little less excited about it being over as much as 2020. 2020 was terrible from a healthcare standpoint. But 2021 was just partially better. We're already still talking about Omicron and we're all just ready to move on. But as we start to move on, we're getting to this area of talking about how to be a better us. And this is the time for making new promises to ourselves, breaking new promises to ourselves, and trying to figure out what all went wrong. I know, for example, I'm still trying to figure out how to lose weight. I've been planning that for the last 15 years at least. I've been great at apparently promising to do that, but never quite great at executing. So let's start with, how does nudging help make a better you?
Yeah, it's a really big and really important question. And I think a lot of people are starting to think about that as they reflect on how did this year go? And as they start to think about, their New Year's resolutions are pretty common at this time of year, right? So what nudging is really helpful for in something like this is what we call the intention action gap. And so this is exactly what you were describing, Darshan, when you say, I really, really plan to, I really want to lose weight or use social media less or whatever it happens to be, but then actually doing it and then sticking with doing it is the really hard part. And so getting from intention to action, that gap is where nudges are the most useful. And for those who aren't familiar, nudges are things that we do that are very tactical, that help us to shape the moment of choice in whatever choice environment we happen to be in, whether that's physical or digital or social, to basically remove friction and make it as easy as possible for people to do what you want them to do, or in this case, for you to do what you want yourself to do in the future. So it's really about closing that intention action gap that they become most useful.
So if we're closing that intention to action gap, what can we do? So first of all, how do you identify what is the right target or the right action that is optimized for nudging?
Yeah, this is something I spend a lot of time talking to people about in my work, because a lot of times we aren't specific enough when we start to set these kind of goals, right? Like saying, I want to lose weight is a goal of sorts, but that's not specific enough to help you get to kind of a plan for execution, essentially. So the right targets are going to be things that you have control over. A lot of times we pick things that we would like to happen, especially when it comes to social goals that aren't necessarily within our control. So pick something that you have control over. But then B, pick something that's really, really specific and it's actually a behavior. So when you say I want to lose weight, that's an outcome of a behavior, but that's not an actual behavior in itself. What's going to get you to that outcome are behaviors like exercise and getting enough sleep and drinking enough water and eating the right diet, right? So that's the second thing, is pick an actual behavioral target as opposed to an outcome target. And then from there, you can get really, really specific about that behavior. And that's usually what you really have to push people on, because they think exercise more. They're like, okay, that's in my control. And that's a behavior, not an outcome. But that's not specific enough, because when are you going to do it? Where are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? How often are you going to do it? Once you can pin down to that level of specificity, then you're well on your way.
So if we're talking about leadership and we're talking about, what you're talking about so far has been talking about what everyday goals are and each of us going, how do we become better at this? But if I'm trying to hire you to help me create better leaders, mm-hmm. how do I choose what an appropriate target would be to create, say, a better leader in healthcare? So whether that's in medical affairs, maybe it's PR. How do you say these are desired behaviors?
That's a big question. There's tons of people who've dedicated to their careers to trying to define what is a good leader, right? Because there's so many different things that can go into it. And so what a good leader looks like, you can also be looking at it from lots of very different angles, right? Is it, when you say leader, are we talking about, external public facing metrics? Are we talking about how well they manage and coach people? Are we talking about how good of a teammate they are? Are we talking about, more traditional KPIs like revenue and those sorts of things? So that's where you would have to start getting really specific and do a little bit of soul searching if you were to be working on leadership yourself or within your organization, is really defining what it is you will point at as success in improving leadership. And then from there, you can do exactly what I did with the exercise example of breaking down, okay, well, once we know the desired outcome, what are the behaviors that feed into that? And specifically, how are we going to make a plan to execute those behaviors?
So let's take an example of that just happened recently. And I feel bad because everyone's picking on this guy, but we all heard about the Better.com CEO who went online and fired 900 people using Zoom.
Yes.
He's been butchered on the internet and by the media. The question I have for you is, let's say they now come in, and I have no idea if Better.com hires you guys, but let's assume they came in and they said, you know what? I know that Suzanne's the perfect person to talk to about this. She's going to help us create a better leadership team and create more attuned leaders, for lack of a better term. My question for you is, how would you even begin to help them target what would make better leaders?
Yeah, so that's an interesting example. I will, say we had nothing to do with that. But I mean, in that particular case, what you would do is do a baseline assessment, right? And so in that exact example, baseline assessment would have shown you that particular person did have a history of problematic management behaviors. So that would have been a really interesting place to start if you were trying to prevent that ultimate incident, right? Is saying, are there warning signs beforehand, right? But then you would do that by also assessing, basically a 360 review, right? And understanding opinions, facts, feelings. And then you can do social network mapping, which can be quite interesting to understand kind of the clusters of relationships and the flow of information within teams and organizations. And then from there, you should have a really good idea of how things are going and where opportunities for improvement might be.
Wow. So a lot of the tools, I've heard of leadership coaching before, and I've heard of sort of psychological coaching that helps leaders. What you're almost talking about is this new level of leadership coaching, which is not so much going after someone's psychology, but easing the pathway to them making more intelligent or socially intelligent decisions. Because let's be honest, there's a part to firing people, 900 people in a single Zoom call. I'll say that's probably the most efficient thing you can do. So there is an intelligence there, but maybe efficiency was not the goal, so that they should have considered. So go on.
Yeah, so that's where it goes back to the soul searching, determining what's important to you, right? If as an organization you literally only care about efficiency, then sure, that might be to your detriment long term in many human relationship cases, but it's a decision you have to make as a strategic leader. But yeah, so what I'm describing is something that I also really emphasize in most of the types of work I do: leadership, healthcare, medication adherence, habits, whatever, is remembering that nobody exists in a vacuum, right? We are very contextual beings. We are very social beings. And so your behaviors day to day are going to be influenced by your context. And so if you don't understand someone's context really well, you're not going to have all the information that you need to be able to understand how to change their behavior and even what their ideal behavior should be. So that's a lens that I often have to remind people of, because it's very easy for us and very natural for us to just think about, I want that person to change their behavior, so I just look at that person, right? And I only do things to that person to make them change. But in fact, there are things that you can do to people's environments without ever actually talking to them that could potentially change their leadership behavior, right? And so not forgetting that sets you way ahead of the game and takes a really different approach that might get you some different outcomes.
So we're talking about this idea of identifying the appropriate behaviors and therefore identifying who you want to be. But as part of that, the next step is keeping those behaviors going, which is the idea of habit. How do you use nudging to create those habits?
Yeah. So as you might imagine, changing habits is one of the most common questions that I'm asked, because it is such a huge driver of behavior. Your personal behavior, leaders' behavior, doctors' behavior, patients' behavior, everywhere, right? We're all human. We all have human psychology. And so habits are really influential. And so when it comes to how I tell people to start tackling changing habits, usually the best way to do it is not to say, I'm going to just cold turkey stop doing this habit that I don't want to do anymore, or I'm going to start from scratch, go 0 to 100 on a brand new habit that I've never done before, but I want to start doing now, because those are both really effortful and really hard. And you're not setting yourself up for the greatest chance of success with that approach. So what's best when it comes to changing habits is to look at the baseline. What habits do I have or do they have now that I can start to piggyback on or start to shape in the direction that we want them to go, right? So if you're trying to break that down even further, you can actually look at, there's a lot of research on habits and there have been a lot of books written about it. And they all have slightly different frameworks, but the really essential pieces come from one of the older and more classic books called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And it says that there are 3 parts to a habit. There's the cue, which is the trigger that starts the habit off. There's the routine, which is the behavior of the habit and any behaviors that might influence it. And then there's the reward, which is the outcome. And these things go in a little circle because ultimately that reward loops back to influencing this to actually become a self-reinforcing loop, which is how our brains learn and make it a habit, right? It's self-reinforcing. So when you think about, okay, I've identified the habits that I have, I know what habit I would rather be doing, how can I look at either the cue or the routine or the reward of my habits that I currently have and start playing with them? So it could be you piggyback that cue from an existing habit and you say, I don't want that to trigger my old habit. I now want to trigger a new habit. So if you're talking about weight loss and your old cue is, I snack a lot when I'm tired. So that cue is being tired. You would say, okay, next time I'm tired, my new routine from the same cue is going to be have some carrot sticks and they're going to be ready to go, as opposed to chips, right? And that's a really simple example of how you can start to hijack. Or you can change the reward, either make something way less rewarding so you don't enjoy it as much, or make the new thing even more rewarding than the old habit. But when you break it down in these little ways, you can almost start to feel like an engineer where you're tinkering with these little components, and it feels very tactical. But it's, if you put in a little bit of this extra time, you'll end up finding that it's a lot less difficult, which means you're much more likely to sustain it long term.
So let's play with that concept a little bit. We've been talking about this idea of habits. In many ways, I talk to people in medical affairs, I talk to people in sales. What they're trying to do is influence someone else's habits. So how do you, if you are in sales, you're trying to help them prescribe something more. If you are in, so I already have a comment from Soham saying, learning a lot from these podcasts, especially nudging. Thanks, Suzanne, for imparting this. Janan obviously has come on. Love hearing and nudging about you, from you. And she said that as well. So it's always so great. But my question for you is, one of the key components you mentioned earlier was this idea that you need to control the habit, that you need to control the behavior. Is there a way to cause nudging if you're not the subject? If someone else is the object, if you will?
Have you ever tried to change someone's behavior? You can
all
do
the time. It fails every single time.
You could do it.
My
a
girlfriend
little
does
bit
not
here
go
and
with
there.
me.
Right. Exactly. It depends on the target. It depends on the influence that you have and the access that you have. But yeah, it's certainly possible. And that's kind of literally my job in like a non-creepy way, right? This is what I do. So it's definitely something that you can do. It's just, it comes down to making sure that you have the right information and you know exactly what that baseline is and what all the influences are. And that's where it gets tricky, right? Is because what's interesting actually is if you ask people, what are your habits? What are the cues? What are the rewards for you? For example, they'll tell you what they think it is, but a lot of times it's not actually what it is, which is part of why you have to take a different approach when you're using behavioral science to change behavior. You have to use different tools and techniques, like more observational things. We do interesting stuff with projection exercises if we're doing interviews to get at past the conscious descriptions of what's driving behavior so you can get to the actual things that are driving behavior, which are often unconscious. So the classic example that I usually give in healthcare is I'm asked very often, how can we optimize doctors' prescribing habits, right? Doctors are very smart, very highly trained people, right? We're not saying they're doing their jobs wrong, but they're also, again, in a context. And that context puts a lot of pressure and doesn't really enable people to necessarily always do their best job if you only have 5 minutes with a patient and so on and so forth, right? So if you ask a doctor, how do you make your prescribing decisions? Invariably, they will tell you, I look at the data and I choose the best one based on the available evidence. And that is the correct answer, and most of them do that to some degree. But in fact, none of them are going to tell you, or almost none, well, it's the one I've always prescribed. This is habit. I didn't really have time to go look at all 50 new papers in the 1 hour a week I have to myself, and so on and so forth, right? So getting past the conscious drivers and into the unconscious or unspoken drivers is a really important way of being successful in nudging someone else's behavior. And you can do that by just people watching, basically, which I think a lot of people enjoy doing. I just get to do it for my job, which is cool.
So you're talking about, say, changing the behavior of a doctor. Let's step away from sales and let's talk a little bit about medical affairs. In the context of medical affairs, you're trying to change the behavior of a doctor for the quote-unquote patient's good, whatever that means. Is it difficult to nudge behavior when the goal itself is so amorphous, like for the patient good? How do you advise a medical affairs group in a pharma company to go, look, we recognize you're not trying to sell. We recognize you're trying to influence physicians to make better decisions, whatever that means. We think you can do it in a more productive way. How would you go about advising them on setting goals and then enacting on those goals?
Yeah, so it would go back almost to the habit situation in the sense that we're talking about the right cue or the right trigger setting off the right behavior, right? And so it gets back to being really specific about, we're not trying to say that this drug is for every single person in the world. We just want to make sure that the right patient gets this drug. And that's where, people are falling through the cracks in a lot of cases, right? Because new things come out and it's really hard to stay abreast of the latest and greatest. So what you would do is you get really specific about communicating to your med affairs people and then eventually to the actual salespeople and the HCPs, this exact patient, like this is what this person looks like as a person, and this is what they look like on paper. And this is when you see this profile or these 3 types of profiles, whatever, think this is the best choice for them, right? So that's usually what you get into is it's about fit. It's not about just blanket sell more drugs. That's not appropriate and ethical and necessary, right? It's about getting the right drugs to the right people. So being really clear about who are the right people and making that come to mind instantly at the time that it's needed and that moment of decision.
So let's talk about a current behavior that most people in pharma and healthcare face all the time, which is you want the time from a busy person to give you some time to sort of discuss what your product is the right fit for. How do you advise salespeople, medical affairs people to go to be able to get access to these doctors? What behaviors do you encourage? How do you have you had a chance to guide people in that direction? Does that question even make sense?
That question did make sense. Yes. Okay. That's another question I do get a lot. And, it depends on the context, right? Because we're a global consultancy. So if you're talking about doctors in the US versus talking about trying to get access to doctors in Europe, it's not even really a thing, right? So it is context based, but US specific. It's also COVID based, right? COVID has changed the entire game. And that's something that we've had to help our clients kind of roll with the punches on as well, is what's the difference between an effective virtual sales rep visit versus an effective in-person rep visit. Totally different, right? I can't bring you snacks virtually. I can't just literally walk with you in the hallway on the way to your next appointment virtually. Those sorts of things are not easily. So it comes down to the specific context and what barriers you're seeing for, each specialty is going to be a really different setup in their flow of their day. And perhaps they work at more than one location or they don't, those sorts of things. So it's going to be about diving into what the specific barriers are. And then once you understand the barriers, that lends itself well to being like, oh, well, then we can get around it in XYZ creative ways.
So do you find yourself being pulled into broader questions, things like how do we get more access to physicians? Or do you find yourself being more asked to help with something like we have, I'm making this up, 10% of our prescribers are high prescribers. We need access to those 10%. Help us figure that piece of the component out. So which of those 2 questions do you get pulled in? I assume both, but percentage-wise, how does that play out?
It is both. And I would say I would expand it beyond the question of accessing such and such physicians to any kind of behavior change. Sure. Often it starts broad. We want to increase prescribing rates. We want to increase medication adherence rates. We're talking about patients, whatever. And so from there, the conversation, and more often it starts at those broad levels. Maybe they're a level down to say, for this specific segment or this type of patient or whatever on this drug. But usually we have to, that's the first part of my job, is to drill down into, okay, but who exactly are we talking about and what exactly are we asking them to do? Because if we're asking them to prescribe more, well, I mean, to whom? Why? Is that even to the point about targeting the right patients and getting the right fit, not just literally more. So usually it starts broad, and then part of the work is to narrow it down into the really specific, actionable behavioral goal.
So the Pareto principle kicks in again, the 80-20 rule, if you will. Exactly. We can keep discussing this forever. We're well past time. But as you know, I'm going to ask you a few questions. The first one that I like to make sure everyone knows is, how can people reach you?
Please reach out to me either on LinkedIn, Suzanne Kirkendall, or I just joined Twitter. Speaking of habits, new social media habit, thanks to Facebook down, disrupting my Instagram habit. So I have a Twitter now. It is Suzanne Kirky. I think we've got it on the screen here, or if you just search my name, it should come up. So would love to talk to you guys more about any kind of behavioral science nudging stuff that's on your mind.
Awesome. And what would you like to ask the audience?
I really want to know what habits people have successfully changed for themselves this year. I know we talked about how hard it is and how easy it is to not close that intention action gap, but I'd love to hear if anybody's had a win.
No. I usually try to
Year's
answer.
not over. We've got 2 weeks.
I got 2 weeks. I'm gonna work on this. What's something you've learned in the last month?
I had a really interesting conversation for the BVA Nudge Unit podcast called Be Good last week. And I won't give it all away because it's not published yet, but we got to speak with Dominic Packer, who co-authored the book, The Power of Us, which is all about how social identities change behavior. And I thought it was just absolutely fascinating. And the book is great. I recommend the book. But it's really interesting looking at how when you prime different social identities for people, they will behave differently in the same situation. So an example from the book, which was a research study that was done, was at a college where, the college had their football team that they were really excited about. And then, there's the evil rival football team that everybody knows is the evil rival. And they had...
We call them the Cowboys.
I won't comment. I don't want to start a fight here. But they had, the people who were the subjects of the experiment walk across like a sidewalk, supposedly just on the way to another building. And then they had someone who is part of the experiment secretly run in front of them, trip. And that person was either wearing the jersey of the same school or the opposite school or just a neutral jersey for that sport. And they saw, how many people actually helped this person. And what was really interesting was if they had, in the first part of the experiment, primed them to think about school spirit, then they would really help the person with their same jersey and they wouldn't help anybody else, the neutral jersey or the rival jersey. But if they had primed a higher, more broad level of identity of just being a football fan, then they helped them equally. So that was really, even if it was the rival, because they're like, well, we're still football fans, right? So we're still an in-group as opposed to an out-group. So the big differences in behavior based on different priming of identities was absolutely fascinating.
I think Janan agrees with that. That is actually really, really interesting. Here's a question. What's something that made you happy in the last week?
Made me happy in the last week? A lot of things. I was just really excited to see all the Christmas lights. Honestly, actually, I live in New York City, and so New York looks very pretty this time of year. And I went out looking at all the Christmas lights, and it just makes you feel happy.
I agree. My girlfriend's lit up the entire house right now, and I'm not looking forward to the bill. We'll
right.
What's something most people don't know about you?
Up until 2 minutes ago, it's that I have a Twitter. So I'll go with that one. That is news. I
love it. That's awesome. And again, just to remind everyone, you can reach Suzanne on Suzanne Kirky on Twitter, or you can find her on LinkedIn at Suzanne Kirkendall.
That's right.
Awesome. Suzanne, this was wonderful as always. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.